The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 4, the chair may postpone further proceedings on approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment. And without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous materials on today's business. We are resuming the markup that began yesterday. We have 2 items left to consider: H.R. 9374 and the en bloc of measures. So we will begin now. Pursuant to notice for purposes of markup, I now call up H.R. 9374, Countering Malign Russian Activities Globally Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 9374, to direct the Secretary of State.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill shall be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. At this time, I recognize myself to speak briefly on this measure. For several years, the Russian Federation has expanded its use of malign influence and activities to exploit government seeking security assistance or diplomatic alliances in the face of alienation by the international community. Mercenaries from the Kremlin-backed Wagner Group have been credibly accused of conducting gross violations of human rights, such as mass killings of civilians, forced disappearances, torture, and other unspeakable acts. Most notably, in Syria, Libya, Mali, and the Central African Republic. The Kremlin has also deployed disinformation campaigns across various regions, often working through tested proxies such as state-sponsored troll farms to exploit instabilities and gain influence. Just this past April, we reported out of committee and passed out of the House my bill, H.R. 7311, the Countering Russian Malign Activities in Africa Act, that would require the State Department to provide a strategy and implementation plan to Congress outlining the United States' efforts to counter Russia's malign influence and activities in Africa. This new bill underscores the fact that Russia's malign influence and activities, while particularly pronounced and egregious in parts of Africa through the use of mercenary forces and troll farms, can be seen in other regions to varying degrees. This bill will allow Congress to better assess the resources needed to counter this growing threat by requiring states to identify and hold accountable Russian and other foreign officials that have facilitated the Kremlin's malign activities in regions of interest. This bill also requires states to submit a strategy and implementation plan outlining U.S. government efforts to address this insidious threat, which could allow Putin to expand his access to illicit funds and resources he needs to continue Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. I support this measure, and I encourage all of my colleagues to do so as well. Now, I realize members wish to speak on the bill and that some members have amendments to offer. I will recognize members of the committee by seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans for the purpose of speaking on this bill. And if you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we will circle back to you. Then we will move on to amendments. I now turn to Mr. McCall for any statements that he may have.
In the interest of time, I will waive an opening statement other than to say I support all these bills, but I also want to congratulate Mr. Perry. I think this is the first markup of this Congress where he has not offered any amendments. So we thank you very much for that.
Do any other members wish to speak on this measure? Hearing no further requests, let's move on to amendments. For what purposes does the representative from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk shall distribute the amendment. The Pfluger 195. The clerk will please report the amendment.
Fluger Amendment Number 195 to HR 9374.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Fluger, you now have 5 minutes.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this issue. I won't take 5 minutes. But let me just start by saying energy security is national security. We talked through this earlier in the markup, and this is just as true for the United States as it is for nations across the world. Russia knows it. They've used it as a geopolitical tool to increase their influence and to reach across the world. And Russian private military contractors like the Wagner Group, which serve as proxies for the Russian state, understand how important energy products are as well. For these reasons, I'll point to another bill that I introduced with my good colleague from California, Mr. Panetta, HR 8339, that's going to require the DoD to examine in detail how Russia is using PMCs across the globe to achieve their strategic objectives, the direct or indirect threats that Russian PMCs present to U.S. interests, and lastly, whether sanctions on these groups are impeding or deterring their behavior. I'm proud to see this legislation included as of now in the final version of the NDAA, and hope that we will sign this into law shortly. But I also applaud you, Mr. Chairman, for 9374, the Countering the Malign Russian Activities Globally Act, and offer my amendment only to augment the text to direct the State Department and to also include in the development of their strategy to counter the malign influence of the Russian Federation more context regarding energy security. Specifically, I hope that through this amendment, the State Department will develop a strategy for an all-of-the-above approach to energy and to examine specifically how American LNG and energy industry expertise, can be leveraged to work with nations in Africa, Latin America, and beyond as partners for development in order to counter Russian efforts to influence these same countries, whether with the military or pseudo-military support or through energy deals like those that Rosatom has been trying to proliferate across the world. For the U.S. to effectively counter Russia, we need to make sure we have an energy strategy and that we are leveraging all of America's resources and capabilities. And as we work with our friends and allies across the world, every one of these countries is coming to the United States saying, we need help. We want your help. We see that you have resources. And I believe that now really is the time to call energy security national security and not let Russia or the Wagner Group or any of these Putin proxies use energy as a malign instrument and a resource to continue to further their influence when we have the capability to stop that. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Fluger, this amendment is not within the Rule 10 jurisdiction of the Foreign Affairs Committee. But Mr. Fluger, guess what? I share your enthusiasm for trade, and I look forward to continuing an engagement with you on these very important issues pertaining to global energy issues and Russia's malign influence. But unfortunately, the rules of the House forbid us from considering this amendment. I've already confirmed this with the parliamentarian, and I look forward to working with you and getting to resolve this particular issue, because I hear you loudly and clearly.
Will the chairman yield?
I yield.
Mr. Chairman, I do have another amendment at the desk that I think will meet the House rules and still get to the point of what I'm trying to achieve.
What number is your amendment?
196, Mr. Chairman.
I see. Clerk needs to distribute the amendment. Let's get that done. I'm going to pause a second to make sure that every member gets a copy of the amendment. Mr. Fluger, reading your amendment, and what I would like to do in working with you, can you withdraw your amendment now? I'll have my staff work with yours now so that we can see if we can come up with appropriate language, because there's other minerals and other things on the continent of Africa other than LNG that may be needed to be included herein. And I think that we can come up to an agreement if we can work that out. So if you could withdraw your amendment now, let our staff talk. I've given them my direction, and let's see if we can work this, and we'll bring it back before this markup is over. That's okay with you.
Mr. Chairman, I think the point of mine is to make sure that that when we're, I applaud your leadership on the fighting back against the PMCs and offering additional solutions. My amendment, instead of using critical minerals on the continent of Africa, really focuses on what America has to offer with our own resources here. So as long as we're talking about American resources, American critical minerals,
Absolutely.
American LNG, then I'm happy to withdraw at this point in time and work with
Yes,
you.
I think that we can get there.
Then
I think we can get to an agreement, Mr. Fluger.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw 196, and our staffs can work together in this markup.
Correct. Thank you. I will withdraw 196 pending bringing it back, doing this markup. Staff work together. Block. Pursuant to notice, for purposes of markup, I now call up the measures and the amendments that we have previously circulated to members officers, which without objection would be considered in block, that each measure is considered as read and the amendments to each are considered as read and are agreed to. And without objection, after remarks, the committee will vote to order the measures favorably reported in block, as amended, if amended, and any amendment or amendments to each measure shall be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. The measures in the en bloc packages are, HR 9243, providing appropriate recognition and treatment needed to enhance relations with ASEAN Act. HR 8654 and Tuberculosis Now Act with a bearer amendment in the nature of a substitute designated number 53, with the bearer amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute designated number 55. And H-Con Res 110, condemning the bravery, courage, commending the bravery, courage, and resolve of the women and men of Iran, demonstrating in more than 80 cities and risking their safety to speak out against the Iranian regime's human rights abuses, with a Tenney Amendment in the nature of a substitute designated number 18, and a Perry Amendment designated number 774. I now recognize myself to speak on the en bloc package. I support all three measures included in this en bloc, one of which is a measure on Iran. Aside from its external terrorism and nuclear endeavors, the Iranian regime has imprisoned, brutalized, and killed its own people in order to retain its grip on power and eliminate dissent. These protests, sparked by the killing of a 22-year-old woman, Mahsa Amini, who was detained for allegedly violating the Islamic Republic's strict dress code, have quickly escalated into calls for the overthrow of Iran's theocracy and pose one of the most serious challenges to the ruling clerics since the 1979 revolution that brought them to power. This resolution commends the bravery, the courage, and the resolve of the women and men of Iran who are participating in the current protests to defend their fundamental human rights and risking their safety to speak out against the human rights abuses committed by the Iranian regime. It asks the Biden administration to continue its important work to support the people of Iran, as well as encourages the private sector to do even more to help Iranians communicate with one another in a safe manner. And the resolution sends a clear message to the Iranian people. The United States Congress and millions of Americans we represent stand with you in your struggle for freedom. We see you. We know the risk you are taking and the danger that you face. Stay strong, as freedom will always win over training. The en bloc also includes a bipartisan measure from Representative Castro and Chavez, which authorizes ASEAN to be designated as an international organization with diplomatic privileges and immunities consistent with the International Organization Immunities Act. ASEAN has been a long-standing and critical partner of the United States for more than 4 decades. During my trip last month to the ASEAN Interparliamentary Summit in Cambodia, I saw firsthand how a stronger partnership with ASEAN can help the United States create a more free and open Indo-Pacific and defend a rules-based order globally. The en bloc also includes a bill led by Reps. Vera and Salazar that reinforces U.S. global health leadership by ensuring the United States government is prioritizing the fight against tuberculosis, the second leading infectious disease killer of adults worldwide behind COVID-19. Even though it is a preventable and curable, TB kills approximately 1.5 million people each year. This measure authorizes critical U.S. investments in prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and care, including by ensuring services are accessible to all who need them. And lastly, it was my intention to include H-Res 1481, Congresswoman Norma Torres's resolution on Guatemala. I wanted it in today's markup agenda, but I was disappointed to learn that our Republican counterparts did not want to mark up Torres's resolution. I continue to remain concerned about Guatemala's ongoing democratic backsliding, and I hope to work with my Republican colleagues in the new year to address this issue and stand with the dozens of prosecutors and judges who have been forced into exile for standing up for corruption. I want to be clear that a resolution supporting human rights defenders and calling out corrupt actors only works if it is bipartisan, which we have tried to do on this committee. Because I believe we must speak as one on this issue for our message to resonate. A partisan vote would not only stall the resolution, but would undermine its very purpose of sending a powerful message. So I'm hopeful, Mr. McCall, that you and I, along with the sponsors of the resolution, can work out a compromise acknowledging the perilous state of the rule of law in Guatemala in the next Congress. I now recognize Ranking Member McCall for his remarks.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do look forward to working with you on the Guatemala resolution, and very important country to us right now. I just want to briefly talk about one of the resolutions from the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Tenney, commending the brave protesters in Iran, speaking out against the Iranian regime's human rights abuses. Beginning in September, the Iranian people took to the streets after the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in Iranian police custody after she was arrested by the morality police for violating mandatory hijab laws. Almost 3 years later, Iranian men, women, and children continue to protest the regime and its brutality. The regime has responded with characteristic cruelty and violence. Well over 340 people have been killed, including dozens of children and many women. This is a women's revolution. This is a regime that murders innocent children. We have a responsibility to support these courageous protesters, and that includes making sure they can tell their story to the world. The Iranian regime is trying desperately to stop information from leaving Iran. We must work to keep internet access options available and functioning to ensure that the world can see the truth about what this regime does to its own citizens. This resolution says loudly, clearly, and with a bipartisan voice that the American people are on the side of the Iranian people. The resolution also condemns the regime for its violence and calls upon the administration to do more to support the protesters, including sanctions. So again, I want to thank the gentlelady from New York. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I now recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans for the purpose of speaking on the en bloc package. If you missed your turn, please let our staff know and we will come back to you. I now recognize Representative Ami Bera of California, who's the chair of the subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific and Central Asia and Nonproliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I support all the important bills in this en bloc package, and I'd like to specifically speak to my bill, HR 8654, the End Tuberculosis Now Act. I'd like to thank my co-lead, Representative Maria Salazar, and her staff for their leadership on this important issue. I'd also like to thank Chair Meeks and Ranking Member McCall and their staff for working with us to ensure this bill receives bipartisan support. Lastly, I'd like to thank Senators Menendez and Young, as well as their staff, for their leadership on this legislation in the Senate. We're excited to see that this bill passed out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee this morning and are hopeful we can send this bill to the President's desk by the end of this Congress. Even though tuberculosis is a preventable, treatable, and curable airborne infection, it is the second leading infectious disease killer worldwide after COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has tragically disrupted years of progress in the fight against TB, Just last year, 10.6 million people fell ill with tuberculosis and 1.6 million people died. However, U.S. investments in USAID's bilateral TB control programs and the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria are critical in supplying life-saving treatment and diagnostic tools. Since 2000, USAID and its partners have saved more than 66 million lives globally. As a doctor, I recognize that U.S. leadership in this fight is not only the right thing to do, but it's essential to our national security. That's why I'm proud to be the lead sponsor of the End Tuberculosis Now Act with my colleague, Representative Maria Salazar. The bill directs the U.S. Agency for International Development to align U.S. TB control efforts with goals established by the international community. These include reducing TB deaths by 95%, reducing TB incidence rates by 90%, and reducing the number of families facing catastrophic health costs due to TB by 100% by 2035. The bill will make USAID's global TB programs more effective by catalyzing support for research and development of new tools to prevent, diagnose, treat, and control tuberculosis, and by strengthening bilateral coordination with the global organizations, including the Stop TB Partnership and the Global Fund. The legislation also requires reporting, evaluating the performance and impact of TB response activities, including efforts to integrate TB control into health systems, strengthening their efforts. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and together we can eradicate this deadly disease. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Chairman yields back. I now recognize Representative Steve Shabbat of Ohio, who's the ranking member on the Subcommittee of Asia Pacific and Central Asia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to voice my support for Representative Castro's H.R. 9243, the Partner with ASEAN Act, legislation which I serve as the principal Republican co-sponsor. This is my last markup on this committee, and having worked quite extensively on issues related to ASEAN over my 26 years here, I'm pleased that we're moving this ASEAN legislation today. It's easy to overlook just how important ASEAN is. When taken together, its 10 countries have the world's 5th largest economy and are the United States' 4th largest destination for exports. If ASEAN were a country, it would be the world's 3rd largest in terms of population. If we are committed to remaining engaged in the Indo-Pacific, and make no mistake, we should be, strengthening our partnership with ASEAN is absolutely critical. And while we shouldn't make our relationship with ASEAN solely about our competition with China, ASEAN is Asia's swing vote in this the competition between freedom and authoritarianism. For those reasons, I support the recent upgrade of our relationship with ASEAN to the level of a comprehensive strategic partnership. And this legislation addresses a gaping hole in our current relationship with ASEAN, that ASEAN as an organization doesn't have an embassy, a diplomatic mission in Washington. One of the things that prevents this is a peculiarity in our current law. The State Department on its own isn't allowed to authorize an embassy for a multilateral organization like ASEAN, which the U.S. isn't a party to. So Congress has to extend such privileges on a case-by-case basis. Over the years, we have done so several times, for example, with the EU and with the African Union. The bill before us today would extend the same treatment to ASEAN as our partners in Europe and in Africa. It's my hope that ASEAN will take advantage of today's legislation, because diplomatic representation, an embassy here essentially, would provide another means for us to deepen our relationship in the years ahead. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative David Cicilline of Rhode Island, who is the chair of the subcommittee on the Middle East, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. and thank you for scheduling this markup. Following the death of Mahsa Amini at the hands of Iran's so-called morality police, the people of Iran, men and women alike, have taken to the streets in over 80 cities across the country to demand their rights and freedoms. Their bravery in the face of suffocating repression and increased impunity by the autocratic Iranian regime is inspiring to everyone and deserves our respect and acknowledgement. Thus, I ask my colleagues to join me in support of this en bloc package and Representative Tenney's bipartisan Resolution 110 so that we can commend the courage of the Iranian people and expose the crimes of the Iranian regime. Nearly 3 months ago, Mahsa Amini was harassed, arrested, and ultimately killed for simply wearing her hijab improperly. The Iranian government has since demonstrated their disdain that they hold for women and for those who yearn to be free. They lied about the circumstances of Amini's death. They arrested journalists for the temerity of reporting on Amini's death. They shot and killed those that took to the streets to fight for human rights. And they have threatened prison and death for those who courageously refuse to back down. It is clear that there's nothing moral about Iran's morality police, nor the regime's failure to recognize the humanity of its own people. I applaud the Biden administration for sanctioning members of Iran's government responsible for the violent crackdown on peaceful protesters, while still providing for increased internet access across Iran. I'm also pleased to see the administration support the UN Rights Council investigations into the Iranian regime human rights violations against peaceful protesters. This is a necessary first step to hold the Iranian regime accountable for its human rights abuses and the persecution of its own people. Members from both sides of the aisle on and off this committee have reached out to me and expressed support for the brave Iranian protesters. Supporting the human rights of every person is a fundamental American value. I look forward to working in a bipartisan way to advance the cause of human rights in Iran and throughout the world. And I want to thank Representatives Tenney and Malinowski, as well as Senators Menendez and Blackburn, for authoring this important resolution, and hope that members of this committee can continue to work in a bipartisan way to spotlight the abuses of the Iranian regime. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
1 yields back. I now recognize Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, who's the ranking member of the subcommittee of the Middle East, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Greg Meeks. And before I begin, I'd like to point out I regret that we're not in person, but indeed, this is the last markup of Congressman Steve Chabot, and I want everyone to know that there was a tribute as a surprise to him on Monday in the Congressional Record, and it has been framed. It will be provided to him as an indication of all of our respect and appreciation for his service in Congress by both political parties. And so it's such a tribute, and indeed we will all so appreciate the service of Steve Chabot. With that, I'm grateful to speak in support of Congresswoman Claudia Tenney's resolution commending the bravery of protesters against the Iranian regime in support of basic human rights. The Iranian regime has committed atrocities against its own citizens, including the horrible killing of Mahsa Amini. Just as I have called on to hold the Iranian regime accountable for their human rights violations and allow the people to right of self-determination and democratic governance, it is equally as important to recognize the bravery of those protesting for their lives against the theocratic regime and the brutal repression that governs with it. These abuses with Iran are unfortunately not new. In 2009, during the Green Revolution protests following the fraudulent presidential election, a beautiful young woman, Neda Aga Sultan, was murdered in the street where she was shamefully left to bleed to death. The inhumanity of the theocratic autocrats in Tehran must never be forgotten as protesters promote the great Iranian people for their freedom and prosperity. Additionally, the despots of Tehran are responsible for over 230,000 deaths in war-torn Yemen. With that in mind, the world is in a critical competition between democracies who live by rule of law, being opposed by autocrats who rule by power of gun. Ukraine today is the must-win war that we have that should be to deter the Chinese Communist Party from mass murder in Taiwan. Additionally, we know that this would be followed by the Iranian theocrats planning to vaporize the people of Israel. with this in mind, I again am in full support of Congressman Claudia Tenney's very visionary legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to speak in support of the en bloc package, including my bill with Asia Subcommittee Ranking Member Steve Chabot, the Partner with ASEAN Act. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, has long been recognized as a critical partner of the United States in the Indo-Pacific. Republican and Democratic administrations alike have reaffirmed the principle of ASEAN centrality, that the ASEAN member states and the diplomatic architecture they convene, such as the East Asia Summit, should play a pivotal role in the future of the region. Despite this understanding, the United States has yet to accord ASEAN the routine diplomatic privileges and immunities accorded to at least 85 international organizations under the International Organizations Immunities Act. Most major regional international organizations, including the European Union, the Organization of American States, and the African Union, already received diplomatic privileges and immunities, so ASEAN's absence is particularly notable. When the U.S. isn't a member of an international organization, we in Congress must pass a law to extend these routine privileges and immunities. This legislation would do exactly that. A commitment to make this change was the key U.S. deliverable in last month's U.S.-ASEAN Summit, where we upgraded our dialogue relations with ASEAN to a comprehensive strategic partnership. In the joint statement following the summit, President Biden welcomed this legislation and called on us to send it to his desk. In practical terms, this change will make officials from the ASEAN Secretariat eligible for diplomatic visas, making it easier for them to travel to the United States, either for bilateral talks or international meetings. This bill could also open the door to a more permanent ASEAN presence in the United States, such as they already have in China, Japan, and South Korea. As co-chair of the ASEAN caucus, I believe we should act to remove these impediments to stronger cooperation between the United States and ASEAN. But I think the most important message this legislation sends is about respect and the value we place on our partnership. Certainly, China or Russia do not put these hurdles in front of ASEAN, and we should not handicap ourselves at a time of strategic competition. We have a great bipartisan tradition of working together to strengthen our partnership with ASEAN. I'm proud to work on this bill with Representative Chabot, who has been a respected leader on Southeast Asian issues, particularly with respect to Cambodia and Burma for years. U.S. dialogue relations with ASEAN date back to 1977. Ann Wagner, my co-chair on the ASEAN caucus and a co-sponsor of this legislation, worked with me on a resolution marking the 40th anniversary of those relations in 2017 that passed the House of Representatives. Under President George W. Bush, the United States was the first non-ASEAN state to name an ambassador to ASEAN in 2008. Under President Obama, we acceded to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia and opened a resident mission in the U.S. in the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta. The renewed engagement symbolized by our comprehensive strategic partnership and the advancement of the Partner with ASEAN Act will continue that long tradition. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation and reject any harmful amendments. And separate from the en bloc, I want to briefly acknowledge and thank my good friend, the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, Albio Citas from New Jersey, who's going to be retiring from Congress. I wanted to thank him for all of his years of wonderful work in building the relationship between the United States and Latin America. I yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Claudia Tenney of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to echo the sentiments of our colleagues, and thank you for your leadership and your bipartisan spirit. And being a fellow New Yorker, we're really grateful to you for your great work over the past year and a half or 2 years. And it's been an honor to serve with you as the chair. Not sure where everybody's going to be next year, but I think you did a great job, and we really appreciate it, especially as fellow New Yorkers. It's an honor to have you chairing this committee. I also want to say again, thank you to Representative Chabot for his leadership, his longtime service, and our link to Cincinnati, one of my second hometown. And I really appreciate it. And also to Ranking Member McCall, thank you for convening today's markup. There's a lot of great legislation today, and including the resolution that I was pleased to introduce with Ranking Member Ranking Member McCall, and also Congressman Malinowski, and all the other bipartisan co-sponsors of this important legislation. And again, thanks to Congressman Malinowski for his great work, and was really great to work with you as well. But this legislation, HCon Res 110, commending the bravery, courage, and resolve of the women and men of Iran, demonstrating in more than 80 cities and risking their safety to speak out against the Iranian violent regime and violent human rights abuses. For nearly 3 months, protests have been raging across Iran in the wake of the killing of Mahsa Amini, who was arrested for violating Iran's strict dress codes and later was killed while in custody. In response to these protests, Iran has violently cracked down on these peaceful protesters. Over 300 protesters have been killed by Iran security forces already, and the regime has triggered widespread internet blackouts to stop all communications and video sharing among the protesters. While this brutal regime continues to protect the abusers and those responsible for the abuse of these brave protesters, the Iranian people have not been able to hide these they've not been able to hide these horrific actions from the world. The United States will continue to expose these human rights abuses and atrocities and the shameful acts for all of history. The bipartisan resolution commends the courageous Iranians protesting in support of their freedoms while condemning the Iranian regime's violent suppression of their rights. Our resolution also urges the Biden administration to use every tool at its disposal to support the Iranian protesters. This includes sanctioning regime officials, expanding internet access in Iran, and opposing the regime's attempts to use facial recognition software and data for mass surveillance. And I thank, again, Representative Malinowski for joining me on letters to the administration and others urging them to crack down on these issues and to provide the internet access that the Iranians needed in order for the rest of the world to hear their cries for help. Finally, this resolution encourages the international community to condemn the Iranian regime's brutality and violence against the protesters, to speak out against Iran's repeated violations of human rights, and to impose harsh sanctions on the Iranian regime. I will continue to stand, and all of us, obviously, from this meeting demonstrates, with the Iranian people and the people of Iran in their struggle to establish a democratic, non-nuclear country where they can one day live freely and safely again. It's imperative that we continue to reveal the truth, especially here in Congress, and do everything in our power to hold this regime accountable for its malign actions against its own people and our sacred partners in the region. I again want to thank Ranking Member McCall for joining me in this, along with Congressman Malinowski, for co-leading on this important resolution. And thank you to all my colleagues, my co-sponsors, all those who are retiring from this committee, for your support and your great working together. I don't know if I'd call us comrades. Sounds like Yugoslavia. But for your camaraderie and for your concern and help in making sure that we make this committee great and bipartisan, and for the great work that we've done under the leadership of Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall. So thank you so much for standing up for the Iranian people, because this is the cause of peace that we need to spread around the world. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Bill Keating of Massachusetts, who's the chair of Subcommittee on Europe, Energy, the Environment, and Cyber, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the chair and Ranking Member McCall for holding this markup today. Before I begin speaking on the measures under consideration, and as this is our last markup of this Congress, I want to take a moment to thank Chairman Meeks for his steadfast commitment to this committee as chairman for the past 2 years. The work of the Foreign Affairs Committee is complex and it's fast changing. Chairman Meeks has created an environment that meets that demand, both in his ability to look forward on issues and be responsible. Chairman Meeks, thank you for taking up tough issues while always taking the utmost effort to maintain bipartisan consensus on the serious issues facing our nation. I want to commend your efforts as the chair of this committee, and I want to thank you as well as your dedicated staff. Now, to speak to the measures under consideration, first, I strongly support H.R. 9374, the Countering Malign Russian Activities Globally Act. Since February, we've seen firsthand Russia's desire to regain its waning global influence. This bill, modeled after the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act, which already passed the House and which I am co-sponsor, will ensure the U.S. government is prepared to continue to counter Russia's malign influence wherever its presence is felt in the world. And I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this legislation. Second, as a co-sponsor of Representative Castro and Representative Chabot's legislation, the partner ASEAN Act, I support this legislation as an important step in strengthening ASEAN's relations. A region of immense and really global importance and immense influence right now as we look at the global picture. Thirdly, I want to strongly support H.R. 8654, the End Tuberculosis Now Act. This legislation has widespread support and ensures the U.S. is a leader in fighting to eliminate tuberculosis throughout comprehensive investments in the alignment and international health community so that we can maintain our healthcare leadership role. The COVID pandemic has taught us the importance of cooperation with regards to healthcare, and this legislation furthers those efforts. Finally, I want to commend the bravery and courage of the men and women of Iran who are demonstrating across the country in support of their human and civil rights. H-Conres 110, which is offered by my colleague, and I thank you for your work on this issue, Representative Tenney, sends a strong and powerful message to the Iranian people that the United States condemns the murder of Mahsa Amini, as well as the current suppression inflicted by the regime against all of its people. The Iranian people are demonstrating to the world their resilience in the face of significant oppression. The United States and this committee stand with the people of Iran in solidarity in their fight. So thank you again, Chairman Meeks, Ranking Member McCall, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Tom Malinowski of New Jersey, who's the vice chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and everybody. I wanted to say a few words about the Iran resolution in particular. And, you know, a lot of people have been arguing these last few years that we're living in an age of rising authoritarianism. And from China to Ukraine to Iran now, we are seeing people in massive numbers rise up to demand or defend democracy. And it should be inspiring to all of us. Many of these movements led by young people who weren't alive when the Berlin Wall fell, who came to the conviction, the universal conviction that democracy is the best form of government on their own through their own experience living under dictatorship. This resolution, which others have spoken to, focuses on Iran, and I want to thank Representative Tenney in particular for leading this with me and for all the work we've done over the last several months in particular to support the people of Iran. In particular, we worked together on legislation that passed in the House through the NDAA that required the Biden administration to do what it has now done by facilitating, despite the sanctions that we appropriately have on Iran, by facilitating the export of technologies that enable the Iranian people to communicate with each other and with the world safely and securely. We've also pressed private companies together to take advantage of the general licenses that are now available for them to do that. This resolution does not provide material support to the Iranian people, but it is still incredibly valuable. Anybody who's ever witnessed or been involved in a protest movement understands that what demonstrators want above all is to be heard and to be seen. And what their repressive governments want above all is for those protesters not to be heard or seen. And so what we are saying today, as we pass this resolution to the brave people of Iran, is we see you, we hear you, we stand with you. We are in awe of your courage, facing bullets and torture every single day, to come out and to demand the basic human rights that every single human being is entitled to. We call in this resolution for all nations to stand with the people of Iran, and for the administration to continue using every possible tool that it has to help them. And I think all of us, whatever our views on the security challenges that the Iranian regime poses, I think we are all united, Republicans and Democrats, in the belief that the ultimate solution to these problems is a government in Iran that truly represents the people of that country, people who, most of them, have absolutely no interest in theocracy or dictatorship. They want to be part of the world. They want to be closer to us than they are today. Finally, since this is going to be my last markup and hearing, I just want to say to everybody how much I love this committee. I was a witness at many hearings for many years before I was a member. I was a member for 4 years and enjoyed every single moment of it. And I particularly enjoyed serving under your leadership, Mr. Chairman, these last couple of years. You have demonstrated, I think, the perfect combination of fairness and firmness, inclusivity and decisiveness where necessary. And I'm going to miss, maybe more than anything, being able to work with you in this capacity for the next 2 years. I've also greatly enjoyed building a friendship with Ranking Member McCall these last few years as well. And I trust that the spirit of bipartisanship in defense of our interests and values, including our defense of human rights in countries like Iran, will continue whether we have a Republican majority or a Democratic majority in this Congress and in this committee. Look forward to working with all of you in whatever capacity may come next for me. And with that, I thank you and yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Kathy Manning of North Carolina, who's the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall, for your leadership and for working to pass this and several other important measures. And Chairman Meeks, let me say what a privilege and honor it has been to serve under your leadership. I want to thank you for your energetic, passionate, and thoughtful leadership of this very important committee. I am proud to support H-Con Res 110, a bipartisan resolution introduced by Representatives Claudia Tenney and Tom Malinowski, which I was proud to co-sponsor, supporting the brave women and men risking their lives to protest in Iran. Mr. Chairman, fundamental human rights are under attack in Iran. It has been nearly 3 months since the brutal death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in the custody of Iran's so-called morality police for allegedly wearing her hairscarf incorrectly. Since then, the world has witnessed thousands of Iranians joining peaceful protests and demonstrations against the regime, calling for their basic rights and freedoms to be respected. Young women and girls have been horribly beaten for protesting a repressive authoritarian government that seeks to control how they dress and act in public. Even today, as the committee considers this resolution, workers in Iran have joined a 3-day strike in support of this movement. In response to these demonstrations, Iran's security forces have reportedly used live ammunition and tear gas against protesters and horrifically have killed more than 300 people, including at least 40 children. Mr. Chairman, we are talking about Iran, whose leaders have no problem sentencing their own people to death for joining demonstrations, and who are willing to do almost anything to maintain their grip and control. Let us be clear, the Iranian people deserve justice and accountability. And that's why I was proud to lead a bipartisan letter with my colleague, Ranking Member Joe Wilson, and several members of this committee, calling for the United Nations to take urgent action to hold Iran accountable for its human rights abuses. Following our bipartisan effort, I was glad that the US and 43 other countries supported our call for a UN special session on Iran. At this session, which was held on November 24th, the UN Human Rights Council voted to establish a new independent investigative mechanism into Iran's brutal use of force and grave human rights abuses. I appreciate the Biden administration's support for the peaceful protesters, for the internet freedom in Iran, and for holding Iranian officials responsible for the brutal violence against their own people. The bipartisan resolution we are considering today will also help shine a light on Iran's human rights abuses. It makes clear that the United States stands with the people of Iran, that we are watching closely, that all Iranians, including young women and girls, are entitled to the same human rights and fundamental freedoms of people all around the world. In closing, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this important bipartisan resolution that I am proud to co-sponsor. And I thank the chairman and the ranking member for their leadership. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Hearing no further requests for recognition, the committee will proceed to consider the notice items in block. Pursuant to the previous order, the question occurs on the measures in block as amended if amended. We're going to take a vote by voice. So all members, please unmute your microphone.
I think they just said this.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed? Aye. Say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Without objection, on each measure ordered today, any amendment or amendments agreed to shall be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, on each measure ordered reported this markup, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. We now move, where we go back? We now return to HR 9274. 9374. For what purpose the representative from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk shall distribute the amendment. Has everyone received a copy of the amendment? The clerk shall please report the amendment.
Pfluger revised amendment number 196 to HR 9374.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. And the representative from Texas is now recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and appreciate the opportunity to work together. And I've said Midland over Moscow many times. Thank you for your support of that overall theme as we really support American energy, American ingenuity, and push back against these really horrible groups that are using energy as a weapon and as a tool. And I think this is the way that we can start to combat it, and we can start to really leverage the resources, the intellectual property, the technology that we have here in the United States, and unleash all sources of American energy. And obviously that includes LNG, and my district will be happy to know that we've worked together and garnered your support on this. With that, I yield back.
Chairman yields back. I now recognize myself. I support this amendment, and I really appreciate Congressman Pfluger's willingness to reach a compromise on this issue. We thank you, and this is the way this committee has been working, and I think that we have an agreement in the spirit of what is the correct thing to do here. Is there any further debate on the amendment? Hearing no further requests to speak, the question is on the revised Fluga Amendment 196. Now, before we take a vote on this, which will be our final vote, I want to make a quick statement. What I want to do before we take this vote, because I know members will be running off after the vote, and I want to say a particular thank you to each and every one of the members, especially to Mr. McCall, who I've been able to make and become friends with, to work with, to discuss the business of this committee, to go back and forth. And even when we have had disagreements, we have not been disagreeable. We've tried to make sure that this committee works in the fine standard of the Foreign Affairs Committee, whether home or abroad. And I look forward to continuing that relationship with him as we move into the 118th Congress. And I hope that everyone that's on this committee that is returning, I prayerfully hope that you're back on the committee, because it's good working with each and every one of you. I think each and every one of you exemplify why the United States of America is indeed the beacon of democracy, which everyone looks at, and actually those that are not authoritarian praises, and those who are authoritarian despises. We work together. We don't always agree, but each and every one of you are here and represent your constituencies, the people. That's why we are the house of the people, and I believe the voices of the people on an international basis. I now want to give a special also word to members who will not be returning to the 118th Congress. I want each and every one of you to know Albio Sirez, Karen Bass, Tom Melanowski, Andy Levin, Steve Shabbat, Adam Kinzinger, Peter Meyer, Lee Zelda. Thank you. Thank you for your service and your dedication to the greatest country that this planet has ever seen, the United States of America. And we wish you well in whatever endeavors that you do after your service here in the United States Congress. And may you travel with Godspeed. And before we take the vote, I think I saw Mr. McCall. Is that your hand that I saw up?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. It's been an honor to serve as your ranking member. We have developed a friendship, and your chairmanship is historic for many reasons, including being the first African American. I think everyone should be proud of that. But your fairness, your patience, sense of humor, and as we always say, we want to agree as Americans. But a democracy is about debate, and when we don't agree, we can agree to disagree civilly and not with contempt of each other. And I think that's always been the tone of this committee, and it's certainly my desire to carry that forward into the next Congress. And as you always say, I'm your partner, you'll be my partner next Congress, and I very much look forward to working with you. And to those who will not be returning, I've enjoyed working with all of you. And I appreciate Tom Malinowski's special words, but all on the roster. We often sometimes lose. Seems like the good people we lose, but know that we'll always be around for you, and we appreciate your dedication and service to the nation. And Mr. Chairman, I hold you with deep and high respect. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. And now we're going to take a vote by voice. All members, please unmute your microphones. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The question now is to report H.R. 9374 with the recommendation that the bill be adopted. We're going to take a vote by voice. All members, please again unmute your microphones. All those in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. And without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. And with that, I believe we have finished our last markup for the 117th Congress. And, when I became the chair, I made a commitment to prioritize the 4 Ds: development, democracy, diplomacy, and diversity. Reflecting on these past 2 years, the dozens of hearings we held, the measures we reported out and passed out of the House, to the men and women on our staff, who I did not mention earlier, I want to take this time to thank the staff on both the Democrat and Republican sides of the aisle, because it's your commitment and your dedication that makes this job that we have as members of the House of Representatives and on this committee, it makes it work. So we thank you. But there's no doubt in my mind that you have made this committee a better committee and a workable committee. And there's no doubt in my mind that we have more work to do, and we will do it as a partner to Mr. McCall in the 118th Congress. So, of course, the work is not over. Challenges remain. So as we enter this new Congress, I look forward, Mr. McCall, to engaging with you and to continue this important work. With that, this hearing is now adjourned.